Hi guys, welcome back. This is Sean from PlayByPause, and today I'm so excited because now I'm outdoor and at the center of KL. Today I have my A7S III in my hand with the latest firmware update, and now they are offering the S-Cinetone. Today's video, we're going to compare the color profile from the A7S III and see how they perform in a real-world scenario. First off, I never used an S-Cinetone before, but from what I read from online, it mentioned that it renders a more pleasing skin tone and creates a film light and give a more richer color at the darker exposure. And today, I'm going to find out. As for comparison, I'm going to use the two famous color profile, which is SLOG3 and HLG3. Me personally, I use a lot of HLG3 on my projects because it renders a more pleasing color and have a lesser artifacts compared to SLOG3. Since we have a new competitor, let's find out who is the best. We're going to start with the color test using the same cameras with 3 different color profile settings. Based on the raw footage, there's no surprise that SLOG3 tends to have a green tint at a skin tone, followed by a more reddish skin tone for S-Cinetone. Lastly, the in-between for HLG3. Aside from skin tone tests, we also did a wider angle shots so they can see how each of them perform under cityscape environments. During color gradings, generally I feel S-Cinetone has a more contrast and more saturation in the shadow compared to HLG3 and SLOG3. In this test, I tried to expose the scene by balancing the subject and background at the same time. Since it's a real-world test, I believe most people will most likely overexpose 1 or 2 stops from a neutral exposure. So I decided to expose the shots in 4 different exposures and balance them back to the correct exposure in post. As you can see, the S-Cinetone handled pretty well between neutral exposure to 1 stops. You are still able to recover some of the highlight for 2 stops exposed, but you may find a more washed out result if you pull down the highlight too much. As for HLG3, it feels like a low contrast, less saturated, higher dynamic range version of S-Cinetones. Generally, I'm pretty satisfied with the dynamic range for HLG3. Something to keep in mind, I have set the zebra level to 29.5%. You may realize that there's some clipping starting from 1 stop overexposed. I'm still able to recover most of the highlights. However, we wouldn't recover the highlight from 2 stop overexposed. When it comes to SLOG3, I believe most of you guys know we are required to overexpose our shot 1.5 or 2 stop from neutral so that we can get most of the dynamic range out of it. Based on my test, I believe SLOG3 has a lesser dynamic range compared to HLG, especially at the highlight area. Besides portrait, we also go with some landscape shots. Honestly, I think S-Cinetone did a pretty good job. It's clean, no weird bending, and it looks great straight out of camera. But I do realize you have to really expose your shot correctly, maybe slightly lower the exposure because the profile is extremely sensitive to light. When it comes to HLG3, you can always get the HDR looks, which some of the people might not like, but it definitely has a great profile if you're looking for a dynamic range. I mean, it's just mind-blowing when it can handle from 2 stop below to 2 stop above without much issue. Since it's a real world test, night scene is definitely one of the time that frighten most of the creator. In most night scene, I will carry my lights, but to keep this test interesting, I decided to just use the street or environment ambient lights to lit up the subject. In post, you can get a similar grip without much issue, and as always, SLOG3 gives a tint of grip, but you can fix it even further if you want. But since I'm trying to do a fair comparison, so I just do a basic color grade with a LUT conversion. This is the part where S-Cinetone kind of falls behind. You try to expose the subject for this dynamic range test, and it seems fine if you expose the shot correctly in S-Cinetone, but it didn't do a good job if you start to tweak the color in post, as you can see from here. But it's not surprised because the process of using S-Cinetone is to get everything right in front of the camera without much post. So it's not advisable to shoot S-Cinetone under low light extreme situation like this. There's no doubt that HLG3 performs better than S-Cinetone because it has a better dynamic range and it handles the shadow and highlight at the same time pretty well. One stop overexposed, still manageable because you are still able to pull back some of the detail at the down lights near the railing. As for SLOG3, you should never underexpose your shots. It does a pretty good job when you expose the shot where it should be, which is 1.5 or 2 stops above based on the exposure compensation meter. When it comes to comparing these profiles, S-Cinetone is definitely out of the comparisons. Between SLOG3 and HLG3, I couldn't give a clear winner because I think HLG3 performed better at shadow area, but SLOG3 have more details in the highlight area. Check out the downlight near the railings, it's really impressive. To me, it depends on shooting style and environments if you are deciding between these two profiles. Some of you guys might not know that Sony a7S III has a dual ISO. For S-Cinetone and HLG3, the low base ISO is 100 and the high base ISO is 2000. As for SLOG3, the low base ISO is 640 and the high base ISO kicks off at 128,000. ISO behave differently based on the picture profiles. Before I conclude which is the best color profile or my preferred color profile, I must point out a few things. To me, what creates a great image is not about the color that produces from the camera only. It's not about the resolutions of the camera. I think it's about the dynamic range. And this is why a lot of cinema cameras have great dynamic range. This comes to the color profiles that we're going to talk about. The first color profile is the S-Cinetones. It always creates a very pleasant result straight out of camera. It always creates a very pleasing, punchy skin tones from S-Cinetones compared to another two color profile. But you must always expose your shot correctly because you can't really do much in post. There's a lot of limitation in post for S-Cinetone. As for SLOG3, the drawback of SLOG3, it has a very high low base ISO 640. You can always use the lowest native ISO 160, but the ISO 640 you have more dynamic range and detail compared to 160. So in other words, you're required to use at least 640 if you're trying to get most out of the S-Log3. This leads to the second issue, which is to create a more shallow depth of field. If you're using S-Log3, you can either crank out your shutter speed, aperture, or the correct way is using an anti-filter. To me, I'm kind of run and gun person, so I don't really use anti-filter that often because I feel it's a bit tedious. Next is, it's very hard to expose your shot correctly because you are required to overexpose your shot when you're using S-Log3. My personal best way is to use expose your shot 1.5 or 2 stops above by checking the exposure compensation meter below the monitor. This can give you a good overall exposure, but I guess the best way is to always check the zebra levels. You can always see where's the clipping point, where it's too underexposed. Lastly, I guess most of the people have this issue when you're color grading in S-Log3, which is the smudgy color and sometimes the blotchy effects. I guess this is the issue of 8 bits from the Sony, but I realize it gets better when I'm using a 10-bit format. I guess if you're trying to get most of your cameras, there's a few things you have to compromise. I believe a lot of people have misconceptions when using SLOG3 because you would think that SLOG3 is the best color profile or it has the most dynamic range compared to other color profile. But that's not really the case because HLG3 can be great or even better than SLOG3. It has a very low base ISO, it has a good dynamic range, it has a better skin tone, it has less artifacts. You can use it in any light condition without much issue, and most importantly, it works for me. So, if you are looking for a great image or you're trying to get a great result, I guess you always have to go back to basics. You have to always lead your environments, choose the correct color profile, expose your shot correctly, do some color correction in post. I guess there's no shortcut if you're trying to get a good result. To me, I'll still use the HLG3 for most of my projects, but after this test, I'll consider to use SLOG3 for low light situations. I'll use S-Cinetone for a more fast-paced project such as Instagram stories or a live video that I don't really need to go through a lot of post-process. In this video, I definitely learned a lot because I always want to create videos based on my own questions I would ask out of my own curiosity and share the information with you guys. I hope this video is helpful and let me know what you guys think. Remember to like this video, subscribe our channel if you haven't, and as always, create, learn, and have fun. I'll see you guys in the next video.